Yo, what's up? It's someone that's no one, and welcome back to another episode of Substances Explained. Today we're covering one of the most known psychedelics of all time, that being LSD-25, or otherwise known as acid. Acid tends to be a lot of people's first psychedelics. It was mine with 1P-LSD. It's a 12-hour experience that could legitimately change your life forever, and the amount of history and culture it has behind it is immensely rich. So rich, in fact, there's no way I could imagine talking about everything in one video. I wanted to cover something acid related here for Bicycle Day, but instead of covering the entire substance like we have with other episodes, we're gonna get kinda niche and focus on a specific topic of it, at least kind of. We'll still cover the pharmacology, dosage, safety, and some culture behind it. But I want to focus on an area I don't feel like we cover too heavily in this series, and that's more the therapeutic side of things. LSD and psychedelics in general have inspired a lot of research in therapy as long as they have been around. It's a therapy known as psychedelic therapy, which involves using psychedelics with psychotherapeutic methods. But I figure a lot of us can naturally be curious to this side of it, just how acid and other psychedelics can help the mind in this way, and how certain practices can play a role into that. We'll look at these connections that can be made with the self, the world around you, the universe, and the things that you do or that may happen to you, and how ultimately this can lead to growth, or maybe not so much in some cases. This is a pretty important side to acid and psychedelics in general, I feel like, and coming to understand this better can set you up for your future trips and what you may get from them. So let me know what you think of this, and like and subscribe if you enjoy. So without further ado, let's dive right into this. So before we get into any therapies or talk about anything medicinal like that, let's lay down some of the basics of LSD you should know. We'll start off by covering some broad history of it, which again, we won't get too specific as this could be considered one of the most famous psychedelic substances that have ever existed. But Bicycle Day is a pretty lit holiday. It occurs right before 420 and is about when good spring vibes have set in or about to set in. LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide, was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in Switzerland. Hofmann was a senior research chemist who worked with ergot fungus, Clavicus purpurea, in an attempt to find a new treatment for migraine headaches. Ergolines have shown to treat migraines and Parkinson's. He began to work with the lysergic acid amide series in 1938, but it wasn't until 1943 in April did the 25th preparation come about. At first he didn't know consuming some of it through his skin, but on April 19th he chose to see what an oral dosage would be like, which he thought was a small dose at the time with a dose of 250 micrograms. For anyone's first trip, especially the first time trying acid ever and not knowing it has these psychedelic effects, this would be a strong ass dose for Hoffman. He did this and rode home on his bike, which is how 419 became known as Bicycle Day. Which, if you think about it, just kinda crazy considering it was during the height of World War II and all. For him, it would be terrifying the way he describes it, with very strong ego dissolution, but it would mark the start of the interest and usage of LSD-25. From Hoffman, it would go to Sandoz's pharmacological department, where Ernst Rothwin began testing on animals for toxicity. LSD has been found to be one of the safer and non-addictive substances out there, so even with massive doses, no animals were physically harmed, though many behavioral changes were noted. To give an example, spiders would make beautiful delicate webs, to things like chimps awkwardly coming back into social standards in chimp colonies. But the first human test of LSD-25, aside from self-experimentation, was inspired by recent schizophrenia research done with mescaline in 1936. Researchers noted that many things in the hallucinogenic experience lined up or could line up with many of the symptoms experienced with schizophrenia. So eventually research was conducted by Dr. Werner Stoll, who was the son of Arthur Stoll. Arthur Stoll was Albert Hofmann's boss actually, and is notably the one who began involvement with ergotamine in the first place, where Hofmann then wanted to experiment with it on humans. But Werner Stoll notably had self-experiments and also tests on his patients as a psychiatrist. It was noted it could help surface repressed memories and thoughts, while also acting as a model for psychosis or schizophrenia. which later would be found to be untrue, as the psychedelic experience doesn't really explain or correlate with why or how those states come about naturally. Stoll himself though seemed to find a liking to it, though there were rumors that one of Stoll's patients committed suicide weeks after an experience. But regardless of this, the Sandoz company began to market LSD after 1947 for research purposes under the name Adelicid. It was actually marketed for both patients and the psychiatrist, so the psychiatrist could gain insight into the world of ideas and sensations of mental patients. So literally, LSD was first sold around the world to researchers and doctors so they could take it themselves. Again, kinda crazy considering the history and all of it. But I guess you can say it wasn't like they were willing to so much. As reported by Hoffman famously, he thought he was poisoned and had a terrible time mentally. But when more researchers came to work with LSD in the 1950s, they would find varying results, which caused many to be skeptical about whether it was actually a model for psychosis or not. Sometimes patients may exhibit similar behaviors, while other times it may provide remarkable medicinal benefits. We aren't going to get super specific with the history, but I do want to bring up some big names that were involved early on that played a huge role not only in the research and therapy, but the culture and what it is today. Al Hubbard was one of the first notable figures to get involved with LSD and the spread of it. Al wasn't necessarily a researcher at first, indirectly you could say he was, but he was mainly interested in making more opportunities for LSD research to take place. He's thought to have exposed it to over 6,000 different people, as when he first partnered with a researcher, when he first found out about it, he sought out to buy one of the biggest LSD stockpiles at the time. He had a businessman-like approach to it. Those who controlled the supply controlled the market. Beyond researchers, as you can imagine, he shared it with all kinds of people: businessmen, celebrities, politicians, lawyers, and so forth. Hubbard would eventually become a therapist in 1956 so he can legitimately partake in research. But notably, Hubbard was involved with Aldous Huxley, where both of these two were involved with mescaline research done by Dr. Humphrey Osmond. Mescaline was the first main interest, but we'll just say that these guys were mainly interested in the possibilities of hallucinogenic research as a whole. They would all experiment with the substance in different ways, and none of them seemed to have gotten a bad experience from it, and instead all saw its potential and beauty. Many books and articles have been published, notably The Doors of Perception by Huxley. You may have also heard of Brave New World too, that was also written by Huxley. But part in this break in strict direct use of LSD may be what's responsible for it being more preferable and enjoyable. Al Hubbard intuitively saw how incredible and helpful LSD could be, bringing in these feelings of love, purpose, knowledge, astonishment, and more. And it is commonly noted that his system made spiritual trips that much more possible, which some of these things we follow today still, like having a good mindset and setting. He noted that of course it would be easy to drive a person crazy with LSD when you give it to them in such a grim cold medical setting, where a therapist is standing by, taking notes on you intently the whole time. Al noted how ambience was crucial for the psychedelic state, how having the right music can either be harmonic or an uncomfortable mess, or how people may like to move around on acid, or have something nice to look at, like paintings in a museum for example. But it wasn't like I was all for free usage about this. There's a balance to it, and he saw the potential psychic hazards. He believed it should be administered and monitored by trained professionals in some way. Ultimately though, many celebrities and other researchers would go on to spread the therapeutic potentials of LSD, the mind-opening potentials of it, and not being such a slave to the system, literally giving you the potential for a rebirth to happen. Which this would give rise to the counterculture and hippie movement. But before we get into this side of it, I do want to bring up some of the research that was done with the CIA and Project MKUltra, and just how that was secretly going on at this time, and some other related projects. So in 1953, it's thought the CIA bought all the supply of LSD-25 from Sandoz Pharmaceutical. Essentially, a huge goal with the project had the intent of how a person could be mind controlled, which they hired on a good number of psychiatric researchers. For example, Ewen Cameron. LSD was of interest because of its reported ability to break down familiar behavior patterns. With the Cold War and Korean War going on at the time, brainwashing techniques were being rumored. So many different experiments took place for this and for treating mental illnesses, often in a very unorthodox manner. Oftentimes they would use their own soldiers, prisoners, drug addicts, or other subjects unwittingly. You can end up with LSD-25, you can end up with a barbiturate, you can end up with an experimental deliriant known as BZ, maybe some synthetic cannabinoid, maybe some antipsychotic, or possibly something else. Maybe you'll be dosed knowingly, maybe it's going to be in a drink or food. And while treatment would be something to look for, a lot of the times, these drugs were studied for their usage in chemical warfare. Ultimately, it included the study of the biochemical, neurophysiological, sociological, and the clinical psychiatric aspects of the compound. One experiment included giving drug addicts LSD for 77 days straight, while doubling or quadrupling the dose to adjust for tolerance. Other infamous ones include techniques of sleep therapy, deep patterning, and psychic driving. Basically, patients will be depatterned, which is defined as being reduced to a vegetative state through a combination of techniques such as high-level electroconvulsive shock and drug-induced sleep, followed by doses of LSD. Patients get reduced to a state where they can't control their urine or feces, they can't feed themselves, and have no ability to state their name, location, or the date. Once this state is achieved is when psychic driving would be introduced. Basically, they would sedate the patients yet again, followed by making them wear headphones to listen to hundreds of hours of audio loops, all while in a sensory isolation room. It's reported some patients will listen to the same message 250,000 times over. This process was to try and achieve the complete erasure of the mind and memory, making for a completely complacent person rid of any previous mental illness. At least that was the goal in mind. So surprised that these methods did little to help, and rather deteriorated the mental state of these unconsenting patients. And the use by the CIA go a lot deeper than this. Most of it was thought to have taken place during the 50s with MKUltra, but there are other cases and experiments, probably more we don't know about, that have taken place. Not exactly the kind of therapy though I think any of us want to go through. But I think it's important that LSD has been experimented with in such ways, and for us to take note of this. And from what we can tell, it doesn't seem to be an effective tool for mind controlling someone. In fact, many of us would probably say the opposite, that it can do a better job at waking someone up and becoming more of an individual in some ways. Thus, it was ruled as too unpredictable and uncontrollable. But just know this was going on, this did happen, and it may relate to where LSD is today and how it became illegal. Which, let's get into how that came about, as it pretty quickly lost its professional influence as a potential medicine and became more associated with recreational mysticism. Then we'll get into some of the specifics with the dosage, some of the specific effects, timing, and some other quick tips that'll set you up for a good trip this bicycle day, or any other acid trip in the future really, especially if you're looking for the therapeutic side of it. But going back to the researchers, Hubert and Huxley were involved with overseeing famous figures like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, otherwise known as Ram Dass. Both were involved in psychedelic research, starting with mushrooms, but making their way to working with LSD and other hallucinogens. Both would go on to partake in research at Harvard, talk in many lectures, and inspire the potential of psychedelics in many ways, Leary more so in a radical carefree way. For example, taking interviews to talk about acid on platforms such as Playboy, or the fact that he created a whole new spiritual organization that surrounded itself on using LSD as its holy sacrament, known as the League for Spiritual Discovery. Both would give hallucinogens to their students though, and eventually they did get banned from all academia over bad criticisms and claims. They would go on to write some notable books, one where it connects LSD with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and they eventually got removed from Mexico and they started their own research in a mansion in New York, where this eventually turned into LSD parties. And I'm not here to question the integrity of this, or how sound this actually was, or anything like that. Honestly, that's stuff for a whole nother video, but you can see how this was creating this perception of pseudoscience with all these personal anecdotes and this unprofessional focus on drug use. And this is really only one example of a much bigger movement overall going on at the time. The counterculture movement had lots of art, music, and free will expressed. I mean, you had Hendrix, Grateful Dead, Pink Floyd, the Beatles, and a ton more that had music which would be considered psychedelic. But you can kind of see that with Hubert and Huxley, they had a more conservative take on it, where it should be restricted in some way and carefully distributed. While with Alpert and Leary, they more so leaned toward the idea that it should be widely spread to help revolutionize society. Which, while many people did tend to agree with this later view, it was seen as a threat to American culture and the way of life. Leary was seen as to blame for a lot of the following prohibition that came concerning research, where even the president made a comment on his influence. But there were other significant figures that gained attention, such as Ken Kesey and the Grateful Dead, having similar parties where LSD would be commonly introduced. Ken Kesey is noted to also have taken part in MK Ultra as well, where the events he went through influenced him to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The electric Kool-Aid acid test by Tom Wolfe was also inspired by these parties. But by 1963, Sandoz's patent on LSD had expired, and now anyone can make it. Albert Hofmann himself was kinda disappointed it had gotten to that point, as reflected in his book, LSD, My Problem Child. By 1966, Congress officially passed the Drug Abuse Control Amendment, which banned the manufacturing and sale of LSD and other hallucinogens, only allowing research for those government approved, which at the time they only allowed 5 researchers, none of which was for any human trials. This eventually developed into what is now currently used with the Controlled Substance Act in 1970, where LSD continues to be placed in Schedule 1, the most dangerous drugs with high potential for abuse. So only a special approval by the FDA will allow research for human testing, which back then it was unlikely. These days though, it's looking a lot much brighter, but over time, the research for it has been far and few. So the history with LSD has been kinda rough in ways. I mean, it can be such a potentially beautiful trip. There can be so much healing and so much to be gained from an LSD trip. But I honestly think a lot of the things going on at the time were just being pushed too soon on society, and unfortunately got fearfully placed as a Schedule 1 substance with no real actual understanding of the substance fully. So let's focus on the potential with psychedelic therapy and the psychiatric usage of LSD, and just some of the effects and benefits it can provide. So like we stated previously, with some of the early research of LSD, it did show there were signs that it can act as a potential treatment in ways. Psychotherapy combined with psychedelics, or psychedelic therapy, was one of the first few things explored, where instead of unknowingly taking LSD, you're actually told about it and how it can help you. We're able to set things up in an environment and make things more comfortable and overall more effective. It could help bring out some repressed thoughts. But the treatment of alcoholism was another early thing explored. Notably, LSD can give one the ability of self-acceptance and self-surrender, which may make a user forced to face the current issues they're dealing with. Another big thing it was explored for was the effects it can have on creativity. I feel this effect brings on natural activity and aesthetic appreciation, which may in turn help with something like depression. Problem solving was also explored somewhat. Recently though, we have seen a surge of more information arise for more varying conditions, which seems to be more and more promising as time goes on. It may be effective for those about to face death and facing the anxiety of that. It could be helpful for those going through other addictions. It actually has shown it might be effective in clearing up cluster headaches, so maybe Hoffman was onto something all along. Interestingly, it may help with inflammation and then those who may be exposed to phantom pains. One of the biggest benefits though, for just about everyone that I think about all the time, even if you don't end up having a good experience, is the neurogenesis. This is the literal repair and growth of neurons and synapses, and the ability of overall neuron functioning. In result, this is known to improve learning and memory. But again, having the right intention, not just doing it in any which setting, you can really get much more healing out of the experience, however you may need that or how it may come to you. Of course though, we aren't going to act like there aren't possible adverse effects. Many physical effects can pop up. Mainly, it has been shown that LSD and psychedelics have activity through their impact on the 5-HT2A receptor. Though I do want to note there has been some research suggesting that it may have impacts on dopamine, oxytocin, as well as cortisol levels, all of which can contribute to the overall effect. But physical effects could include dilated pupils, higher body temperature, increased heart rate and blood pressure, sweating, a loss of appetite, sleeplessness, dry mouth, and even tremors. It can be uncomfortable at times, I feel, if your body isn't set right, like if you have a garbage meal beforehand or haven't really been taking care of yourself the best. You may feel these things more on the trip. And of course, there is the risk for some adverse mental effects, where oftentimes the stronger the dose, the more these can pop up. Things like anxiety, panic, paranoia, or confusion. You can have feelings of being overwhelmed and being stressed out at times. Again though, the exact opposite could happen, where you have feelings of joy, euphoria, a want to be alive, and feeling spiritual and connected with the universe. Besides that, there can be some non-direct effects that concern your general safety. For example, maybe going on a bike ride on acid isn't the smartest idea, especially if you're in a busy area with a lot of traffic. Or there have been cases of people sometimes jumping or falling off of buildings and balconies. Sometimes suicide ideation can pop up, and is really a risk if you do consider yourself a sensitive individual when it comes to something like that. There is no reported case of an overdose with LSD. Sometimes high doses can result in a panic disaster bad trip, where users can feel like they're dying with effects like vomiting, breathing problems and whatnot, but in all cases, none have actually died from LSD itself. Seizure can be possible if you're predisposed to them and are in a susceptible state. What many consider to be a risk though are research chemicals. The M-Bomb series can be placed on a tab in a similar way, and it costs a whole lot less to make. These tabs have a metallic taste, while LSD won't taste like anything. With M-Bomb, you have actual toxicity to worry about, and fatalities have been reported. Besides that, there are some long-term effects that could be possible. The physical addiction of LSD hasn't been documented, but I do believe there is potential for some mental addiction and abuse to occur at times. HPPD and flashbacks are the primary concern with too much hallucinogenic usage, a condition where you still have hallucinations even when you're finished tripping. This can be to the point where it's problematic for everyday living. Besides this though, for the experience, other hallucinogenic effects will vary greatly on dosage, but can include things like time distortions, thought loops, reduced depression, visual drifting, color enhancements, after images, patternings, wakefulness, increased libido, potential delusions, ego loss, deja vu, various transformations, spiritual unity, and much more. Dosing is going to vary heavily big on what you're looking for, I'd say, but for most novice users and first timers, a tab is typically a really good starting point. Experienced users, hey, that's really on you and what you think you're meant to take. You know, what's best for you and how the universe will treat you with that. If you let it dissolve on your tongue, there's much more bioavailability than if you're just to swallow it. And it is a long experience, so to be safe, have about 12 hours just planned out to be free. You don't want to be stressing about being somewhere or doing anything too important like that. It's always great to have a trip sitter, but make sure they're good for you and someone who will really let you experience the best of your trip. Having an open mind and accepting whatever comes up is probably one of the best things you can do for yourself as well. You may be faced with some uncomfortable facts about yourself, but do your best to try and take these lessons in and integrate. Remember that it all happens for a reason and that there's nothing to be ashamed of. There may be some things or methods you may want to try and focus on that we brought up in this video, but really when it comes to it, if you can get some good music going, have an activity that inspires movement and visual flow, ideally something like a walk or bike ride, and if you can just surround yourself with some good vibes overall, maybe some close friends or being out in nature or wherever, those are some of the best things that you can do that can matter a lot for setting yourself up for a good experience. Purpose and having a good reason for yourself are also huge. Just give your best intent and effort, and the karmic flow of the universe will reflect upon you what you're meant to experience. You never know what you'll be quite in store for, but just know that there's always the chance to come out reborn. So we're gonna end things off there for today, guys. I feel like we gave a pretty good base history and description of how LSD has been evolved as a therapeutic treatment, and how it's continuing to show promising research for the future as a potential legitimate option. I think there's some people who may look past this effect sometimes with acid, so it's always good to take a step back and reflect on all the wonders that go on when we take LSD. If you're celebrating this Friday, be safe, test your shit, and enjoy this beautiful chemical that we've been blessed with. It's been Someone That's No One, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.